Good evening and welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs. I, like perhaps many of you, have issues with the ways that both conventional conservatives and traditional liberals tend to frame many of their positions. Indeed, more and more, I find myself living by that Shakespearean injunction first uttered in Romeo and Juliet, to wit, a plague on both your houses. That's one of the many reasons why I am so fond of Brink Lindsey, tonight's guest and author of a new work currently available as an ebook titled Human Capitalism: How Economic Growth Has Made Us Smarter and More Unequal. As we all know, in the new, present, knowledge-based economy, the successful seem to be riding an ever-increasing virtuous cycle, while the unsuccessful seem trapped in an ever more vicious cycle. When examining this economic equality, this growing economic inequality, and the various heavy-handed proposals that are aimed at addressing it, Brink says, partisans on the left blame capitalism run amok. Their counterparts on the right cry class warfare. But maybe neither side really gets it. As Brink put it in a recent Wall Street Journal article, quote, contrary to the conventional wisdom of the right, the growing divide between the highly skilled elite and everyone else is a real problem that threatens our economic vitality. And counter to the conventional wisdom of the left, the rise in inequality is attributable not to the failure of capitalism, but to its success. Which is to say, or more accurately, as Brink says, another way to look at the present inequality is that it is the dark lining of an otherwise silver cloud. There's hope, in other words, and there are ways to spread the benefits of the current economy beyond those who are already enjoying its rewards. And in Human Capitalism, Brink not only diagnoses the problem dispassionately, he offers some prescriptions for remedying the present dilemma. Brink earned his undergraduate degree at Princeton and a law degree at Harvard. He is a senior fellow both at the Kauffman Foundation here in Kansas City, as well as the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. He's the author of several books, most notably The Age of Abundance: How Prosperity Transformed America's Politics and Culture, which he spoke about at the library back in 2008. He's long overdue for a return. We're glad to have him back. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Brink Lindsey.
Thank you so much, Henry, for that kind introduction. Thank all of you for coming out on a cold night to hear serious talk about serious stuff. It's a great pleasure to be back at this venue, and it's nice to be back at spent the day at the Kauffman Foundation today, and it's good to be with very interesting colleagues and seeing what they're up to. So today I'm going to talk about this book, ebook now, soon to be a real book. But much cheaper in ebook form. You can buy it for a pittance on for your Kindle. Anyway, how to start? Let's start with the book's title, Human Capitalism. Okay, that's a play on the term human capital, which is economists speak for valuable knowledge and skills. So the idea here is that in the knowledge economy, the information economy, the post-industrial economy, whatever you want to call it, the key asset, the most important form of wealth these days, is no longer physical capital, land, plant, and equipment, or even financial capital, money. The most important form of wealth in the modern contemporary world is human capital. What's up here? The economist Gary Becker, who won a Nobel Prize for his work on human capital, has estimated that approximately 70% of all private investment in the United States today is in human capital. When you add up all the spending on education and worker training and healthcare to keep our life support system for our brains intact, then you get to see that truly the lion's share of our wealth today lies in the form of human capital. And the greatest prizes in terms of income and status and interesting, challenging work go to those who are flush with human capital. So this book is about human capital. What is it? I gave you a quick description, but what do we really mean? What does it mean to be valuable? What are the valuable knowledges and skills that command a premium in the marketplace? Why is it so important now? Why is it more important now than in the past? Why do some people have lots of human capital and other people not so much? And why have the fortunes of the human capital haves and human capital have-nots been diverging over the past generation? Those are the topics that I address in the book and that I will touch upon in this talk today. To understand why the importance of human capital has been rising, and to understand actually what the nature of human capital is, the central argument I make in my book is that at the root of this phenomenon is the association between economic growth and development on the one hand and rising social complexity on the other. That is, economic development promotes cognitive development. So economic growth makes us smarter because economic growth makes the world more complex and therefore requires us to stretch our minds and to develop our mental capabilities to keep up with this increasingly complex state of affairs. So what do I mean when I say the world's getting more complex? Let's look at three different dimensions. First, knowledge. The amount of knowledge and know-how distributed throughout society is enormous and growing by leaps and bounds every day. Back in 2003, which in internet time is a million years ago, an economist at Berkeley named Hal Varian, who is now chief economist at Google, tried with some colleagues to estimate how much new information is being produced in the world every year. And at that time, they calculated that the amount of new information that's just stored in electronic form, the stuff that's on dead trees is actually a footnote compared to the stuff that is now stored in electronic form, amounts to, just the new information that is flooding into our world every year amounts to the equivalent of about 15,000 libraries of Congress. So that's information overload to the nth degree. Second dimension, interpersonally. We today depend for our livelihood, welfare, well-being on millions, maybe billions of complete strangers in a global division of labor. And most of whom we have no idea who they are and we will never meet them. And yet, the clothes I wear, the phone I use, the car I drive, everything, right, comes from strangers. Even in my personal interactions over the course of the day, in your personal interactions, on the street, in the office, in the stores, online, in email, you're dealing with hundreds, maybe thousands of people over the course of a working year that you just don't know very well at all. You don't know their history, you don't know their story, you don't know their family. You just know them in a very instrumental and shallow kind of way. But somehow or another, you get along with them all, right? And it works. So in terms of interpersonal interaction, the world is much more complex today than it used to be. And finally,
in the interior world of choice. We are bombarded with choices today as a function of our greater wealth. Basically, wealth just means more choices. And these are choices that range from the profound, who am I going to marry? Who are my friends going to be? Where am I going to live? What is my career going to be? The constitution of your identity is up to you. To the trivial, which of these umpteen thousand different brands of breakfast cereal in the grocery store aisle am I going to take home with me? Right? So the world is getting more complex, and that changes the way we think, because contrast this complex world to the world that human beings evolved in, that human brains evolved in, and that human beings have spent most of their existence in, either as hunter-gatherers living in small tribes or as self-sufficient peasants living in small villages. In that sort of natural state of nature for human beings, let's think about the amount of knowledge. In the Stone Age tribe, the amount of knowledge, all of the knowledge of human knowledge is just stored in human heads, right? There's no writing, there's no way to preserve anything else. So everything that is known is in somebody's head, and in your tribe, pretty much everybody knows kind of the same thing, right? So that's the sum of knowledge in the world. You've got a wise man, a shaman or something, who he has some specialized knowledge. Other than that, everybody kind of knows the same thing, and it's not very much. And it's all very concrete. It's all about your specific circumstances, your specific area that you're living in. Likewise, interpersonally, if you live in a tribe of 150 people or in a village of 1,000 people, you know all of those people. You're related to a bunch of them. You've grown up with all of them. The normal human condition in the agricultural age was to be born, live, and die in a 5-10 mile radius. And so you are intimately familiar with everybody you deal with. It's interesting, there's an anthropologist, Robin Dunbar, and he's now the eponymous Dunbar number. Turns out if you look through people's Rolodexes, back when they had such things, back before Facebook allowed you to cheat to compile a bunch of friends who aren't really your friends, turns out that the typical Rolodex has about 150 people in it. That seems to be about the limit of meaningful social relationships a human being can have. And it turns out to be about the size of a Stone Age tribe. So we're hardwired to know 150 people max, and yet we deal with gajillions, right? And then in terms of choice, right? In the state of nature, in this for the hunter-gatherer, for the peasant, there's not many choices, right? You're not going to choose where you live where you were born. You're not going to choose what you do. What you do is try to wrest enough calories out of nature to not starve. You're not going to choose who you marry. Your parents are going to fix that up for you. You're not going to choose who your friends are. They're going to be with the people you grew up with. And there's no breakfast cereals and there's no grocery stores. So choice is extremely narrowly circumscribed. And most of all of your life is dictated by the past. You live according to tradition. You live according to ritual. And your looking ahead really extends to the day's routine or the cycle of the seasons. So contrast that world to our modern world, and how do these Stone Age brains dealing with 150 people and not a lot of stuff to know and not a lot of choices, how do they cope with modern complexity? They cope with it by reorienting the way we think in the direction of much greater abstraction. We live abstractly. We deal in abstractions. That is how we function. Abstractions are shortcuts that generalize so that instead of all these blooming, buzzing, overwhelming particulars, you can get the general picture. So in our intellectual world, once upon a time, the key knowledge was, as I mentioned, concrete mastery of detail, to know intimately your hunting grounds or the soil conditions, to know intimately when bad weather is coming. To know stuff about your world in concrete detail was the key. Today, the key is book learning, abstract learning in these abstract symbols called written language that is about a whole really general, broad concepts, and that is completely different from how people used to think. It's so natural to us to think like this and to think that being intelligent means being good at book learning, whereas in the past, intelligence would have been something entirely different, and the kind of facility we have with book learning today would be utterly pointless. So, just to illustrate, this facility with abstract thinking, of thinking in terms of kind of logical rigor, divorced from any specific context. You can apply syllogistic reasoning to anything, right? That's not the way normal people used to think. People thought concretely. There was a Soviet psychologist roaming around the stands in the 1930s, trying to figure out for his Communist Party bosses whether these retrograde peasants could be refashioned into the new Soviet man, and he had very discouraging results. And, in particular, he had this encounter with, he found that logical reasoning was just not in the toolkit of most of the people he was talking with. He dealt with one peasant. He said, okay, I'm going to tell you two statements, and then I'm going to ask you a question. Statement one, there are no camels in Germany. Statement two, Berlin is a city in Germany. Now I'm going to ask you a question, are there camels in Berlin? The guy said, I don't know, I've never been there. Let me rephrase. He goes through the statements again. So, are there camels in Germany? Every big town I've ever been to has camels. I presume so. No, I just told you that. And he wouldn't bite. He wouldn't accept it. He just wouldn't engage in that kind of style of context-independent logical thinking that is second nature to us today. In terms of interpersonal dealings, the leap to abstraction takes the form of adopting and switching in and out of all of these social roles, these thin practical identities that we all know the rules to, and so we can see what role you're playing, and I know what that part is, and I know my part in relation to that part, and we can get along even though we don't know each other. So the role of driver versus pedestrian versus policeman, the role of customer versus sales clerk versus boss and manager. All of these roles that we absorb and jump in and out of 100 times a day is not how normal people used to live, right? They were themselves all the time. Instead, we jump in and out of these various thin identities, and they're not the real us. And if we spend all of our time doing that kind of thing, we feel sort of alienated from our true selves, and yet these thin identities, these abstract roles that we learn to master, enable us to engage in personal interactions of a complexity far beyond what was the norm in the past. And then finally, the leap to abstraction inside our heads when it comes to the dizzying choices we now face entails the imagination of a hypothetical future self. So in the past, the world was directed by the past. It's directed by tradition and ritual. Today, we live in future-oriented worlds. We're always planning what we're going to do. We're planning our career. We're planning our bucket list of things we have to get done. We're thinking always what are the interests not only of my current impulses and desires, but my interests of my hypothetical, abstractly imagined future self. And so even if present self feels hunger pangs, I think about the interests of future self, and future self wants to be slim. So that negotiation's going on constantly. And we know how to do that. And it's second nature to us, and yet it is a profoundly alien and exotic way of living compared to how most human beings lived for most of history. So, that said, I think human capital can best be understood as the cultural adaptation of abstract styles of thinking that allow us to deal with and master complexity. So, intellectual abstraction, book learning, interpersonal abstraction, jumping in and out of roles, and personal, intrapersonal abstraction, this imagined future self. So human capital represents a cultural adaptation to exotic social circumstances, modern complexity, and it consists of fluency with abstract styles of intellectual, social, and personal living. So this leap to abstraction has been driven by economic growth, and it has our capacity to make the jump to abstraction and to master social complexity has enabled enormous social progress. First, it has enabled the great wealth creation that has occurred over the past couple hundred years in the era of modern economic growth and has allowed us to live lives that are longer, healthier, happier, and more convenient than those of anybody before us. They have the progress of complexity has resulted in an enormous increase in the degree to which we are educated. So in 1900, 6% of American teenagers graduated from high school, 6%. And an asterisk graduated from college. Today, it's about 75% graduated from high school, and about a third graduated from college. So a huge increase in schooling and in book learning, and a revolution in the lives of children and adolescents. That they now spend all of this time in classrooms that that's just not how kids used to live, right? But we've stopped up here with a whole bunch of intellectual abstractions. The occupational structure, the nature of work has transformed with the rise of complexity. We need lots more people that can handle complex tasks and that can oversee and manage complex social processes. So what constitutes work today is very different from what constituted work 100 years ago. 100 years ago in the United States, 80% of jobs in the United States were farmers, manual laborers, and domestic servants. Now, over 60% of jobs are white-collar office jobs, where people are dealing in nothing but abstractions, sitting in offices dealing with words and numbers. So a complete transformation in the nature of work away from work that was hard and physically brutal and chewed up your body and did not exercise your mind at all, to work that is physically comfortable and, at least from time to time, intellectually challenging. Another form of social progress is breaking down barriers of discrimination. Not necessarily, well, certainly moral enlightenment has been a part of this story, but the underlying driver, I believe, has been economics. Once upon a time, there were more smart people than there were jobs in the economy that needed smart people. And so the people who got the plum jobs, who got the interesting, challenging, high-paying work, there were a lot more people who could fill those jobs than there were jobs to fill. And so access to those jobs was gated. It was protected. Basically, you had to be the right gender. You had to be the right color. You had to have the right surname. So sexism, racism, ethnic discrimination preserved the old boys network, which allowed the elite positions in American society to go to people with the right sex, right surname, right ethnicity. But we now live in an age where there are more jobs requiring smart people than there are smart people. I don't know when that switch happened, but we've clearly moved. And along that way, that changed people's thinking, right? Instead of protecting the plum jobs from outsiders, now we're desperately recruiting people who can get the work done. And I believe that need, the objective social need to use all available talent, is an important part of the falling barriers to women in the workplace, the falling barriers for racial discrimination, because just the requirements of modern society would not tolerate this kind of discrimination. It was just too dysfunctional to be maintained. So that's the silver cloud that Henry quoted me as mentioning. We're richer, we're smarter, we're more inclusive. But there's another side to the coin, or there's a dark lining to the silver cloud. And that is that the rise of human capitalism. Capitalism was Karl Marx's term for a social system based on the primacy of physical capital and the private ownership of physical capital. Now we live in a world where the main asset is human capital, so let's call it human capitalism. The rise of human capitalism is associated with large differences in people. Some people have lots of human capital, some people not so much. And the people who have lots are blessed, and the people who don't have so much may struggle. And why is that? Where do these differences come from? Certainly they come to some degree from differences in natural ability. No getting around that. And those can be important. But what I want to focus on are the other sources of those differences. And the primary source, I think, will become clear to you if you think about human capital, as I've mentioned, as a cultural adaptation to complexity. That is, our way of thinking, our skills, our habits have adapted to fit these new circumstances. So from that, it ought to follow that the people who are most subjected to, most immersed in contemporary social complexity will be the people who are most well adapted to dealing with it, whereas people who don't encounter it as much are not going to develop the adaptations to an environment that they aren't really that deeply exposed to. So if you look at the contemporary economy, we often think of the socioeconomic highs to lows. We think of it vertically, right, from the pyramid, right? But let's think about it horizontally, and let's think about at the center of a contemporary economy, because things are most complex, and the people who work there are the people who are most fluent in complexity, and the people who have the most book learning and the widest and most versatile social networks, and who have the best developed habits of deferred gratification and long time horizons. Those are the managers and professionals and entrepreneurs that run the show in contemporary economic life. Then out on the periphery, you have the working class, where the book learning required to do relatively simple manual tasks or clerical tasks isn't so much. The social interactions on the job are less complex. And there isn't much of a career path. It's just a job. So the whole long-term planning thing isn't as engaged as much. So it makes sense to me that there is a connection and a kind of a chicken and egg relationship between economic class and cognitive culture. So that ends up having some kind of nasty consequences. So if it turns out, as it is the case today, that your socioeconomic position depends heavily on your endowment of human capital, then it also is the case these days that your adult endowment of human capital depends very heavily on your parents' socioeconomic position. So if you are raised by college-educated white-collar professionals, from birth you are immersed in this world of complexity. You are immersed in intellectual stimulation and challenge. You are force-marched through one organized childhood activity after another, where you learn to deal with people that you didn't grow up with and you're not related to, but you have common interests with them, and that's good enough. And you learn to structure your time and go from activity to activity. And constantly you're being berated as a kid to develop longer time horizons, to defer gratification, to choose the hard right over the easy wrong, to plan ahead. And this is drummed into you so frequently that it becomes, as I said, second nature. Contrast this with growing up in an impoverished household, a household in poverty. There, the intellectual stimulation is much less because you don't have highly educated parents who are seeing every second as a potentially teachable moment. You don't have the broad social networks. People, working class and underclass people, tend to have much tighter-knit families and much stronger family relationships and relationships with people in their neighborhood, but less broad-ranging social networks based on common interests rather than on shared background. And the idea of planning ahead and long time horizons doesn't always make a lot of sense in poverty when life is so chaotic and so unpredictable that one little thing, part in your car breaks and you can't get to work and you don't have money to repair it, and so you'll end up losing your job because you can't drive, and that just starts a cascade of misfortunes. There's no margin when you're poor, and so little things can have huge consequences, which make it very difficult to plan long-term because life isn't stable enough for long-term plans to come to fruition. Let me go back and focus on one aspect here, which is the differential in intellectual stimulation, because I think that's really key for understanding class differences in school performance. There's a pair of child psychologists, Betty Hart and Todd Risley, who went and spent lots of time with select families from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So professional couples and working class couples and families in poverty. And they just sat and they cataloged how many utterances the parents made to their kids, how many words they spoke at their children, to their children. And the difference is astonishing. So amongst the upper class kids, by the age of 3, they had heard 45 million words from their parents. By contrast, the working class kids had heard 26 million words, and the underclass kids had heard 13 million words. So a 30 million word gap, a 3-to-1 gap between the top and the bottom in terms of intellectual stimulation. Big shock. Also big vocabulary differences. So at age 3, the upper middle class kids had vocabularies of 1,176 words. The working class kids' vocabularies averaged 749 words. The underclass kids' vocabularies averaged 525 words, so less than half of the privileged kids. Okay, so this is at age 3. There's already this huge gap. You get to 5, 6 when you show up at school, and you're doing the big, huge sort that separates people that are comfortable with an academic setting and people who aren't, learning to read. Who's going to have the better shot at learning to read? The guy who has twice the vocabulary or the guy who has half the vocabulary? Who's going to think, this is fun because I know how to do it, and the teacher is like patting me on the head and saying, good job, Johnny. And who is going to get discouraged and think, well, maybe this school thing is for the birds? And who's going to have a bad interaction with the teacher and sour on schooling? It's not a big shock that even fairly modest differences at an early age can then snowball into very different life trajectories. So there are these big class differences. So we've had one class structure based on ethnicity dissolve over the course of the 20th century, and then at the end of the 20th century, a new class structure based on educational class structure along educational lines emerge in its stead. The old class system was based on who you know. This class system was based on what you know. But it still has bite, and it still can be self-perpetuating. It's been this state of affairs that some people have lots of human capital and some people not so much, has been the case always. Why is it just in the past generation that we started to hear about rising inequality and this reemergence of class differences. The main story is that there has been a slowdown in human capital development. So the demand for human capital, the demand for highly skilled workers keeps going up, 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 up. But the supply of new highly skilled workers has bogged down. The high school graduation rate today is lower than it was in 1970. That's terrible. The college graduation rate for 20-somethings today is higher than it was in 1980 for women, but the same for men, no growth at all. And the overall growth in highly skilled college-educated workers has slowed way down. According to Harvard economists Golden and Katz, the average annual growth in the relative supply of college grads averaged 3.8% in the period 1960 to 1980. From 1980 to 2005, fell almost in half to 2.0%. So if you've got rising demand and stagnating supply, what's going to happen? The market is going to bid up the price of the scarce commodity being highly skilled workers. And so we have seen the college wage premium, the premium for having a college diploma, go up in value significantly over the course of the past generation. In 1980, the average college grad made about 30% more than the average high school grad. Over the course of the 80s and 90s, it moved up, more than doubled to 70%, and it's stayed high ever since. And that staying high ever since part is weird and puzzling, because here's a market signal. The market is saying, we're going to pay more for college grads. We want more smart people. We want more highly educated, highly skilled people. And yet, where's the supply response? It's not happening. And that's why this premium is staying high. And if you want to see what is happening and why the supply isn't moving, here's a set of statistics that's kind of dispiriting from a pair of economists named Danziger and Whiteman. They were looking at the odds of going to college and getting a degree by the age of 25 for people born back in the 1950s and then people born around 1980. And looking at the effect on those odds of having parents that went to college. So for kids born in the years 56 to 58, for the kids of college, kids who had one parent who went to college, 37% of them got a college degree by the age of 25. For everybody else, it was 8%. Okay? Flash forward now to kids born between 1979 and 82, so 30-somethings today. The percentage of kids with college-educated parents who got a college degree by the age of 25 had gone up to 53%. The percentage of everybody else had gone down to 6%. So here you see the market is sending this signal. We need more college diplomas and people holding them. And in the college-educated elite has responded to those signals. More and more of them have gone to college. But those signals haven't penetrated at all the rest of society. And I think that there are cultural barriers that have prevented those signals from reaching or from changing the behaviors of people raised in those cultures. It's not just that. It's also that the economics have changed. So an important part of this new inequality is a phenomenon that is called labor market polarization by the people who have discovered it. What does that mean? So once upon a time, the difference between the classes was masked by a big set of middle skill level jobs where the difference between being at the high end of blue collar and the low end of white collar, there's not much of a difference. And over the course of the 20th century, we saw this change in occupational structure that I talked about, and change was dramatic, but it took the form of an general upskilling of the occupational structure. What does that mean? That means the fastest growing jobs in the 20th century were the highest skilled jobs, the slowest growing jobs were the lowest skilled jobs, and mid-skilled jobs were in the middle. But starting in the 90s, something changed so that high skilled jobs kept growing and low skilled jobs kept growing, but mid-skilled jobs slowed down. So we had the polarization in the occupational structure. Lots of high, lots of low, not so much in the middle anymore. And it turns out that this middle of the occupational structure has been in the crosshairs of two phenomena, automation, computerization, and globalization, but especially automation and computerization. It turns out that that in this middle, where you had the higher end blue-collar jobs, lower end white-collar jobs, the jobs were complicated, but routine. You could accurately describe all the steps in that job, which means you could program a computer to do them. Or you could send it off and let Chinese workers do it for much less. So at any rate, these are jobs that economic progress, that economic development has been eliminating faster than other kinds of jobs. And that means, therefore, that the kind of top echelons of the blue-collar career path or career possibilities have been wiped out or are being wiped out. So that means that the cost of being raised in a working class household compared to the opportunities you could have if you had had different parents have gone up because now the gap is bigger because the middle has dropped out. So that why weren't working class families oriented towards doing well in school and going to college? Because until relatively recently, a working class lifestyle was consistent with a rapidly rising standard of living and with a standard of living that wasn't terribly different from white-collar jobs that at the low end that needed a college degree. So in fact, the college wage premium was going down during the 60s and 70s, thanks to this huge influx of new college students after World War II, and with the GI Bill and otherwise, such that in the late 70s, a very big talked about book was The Overeducated American. We're educating too many people and the college degree is not worth anything. And so now, with this economic polarization, things have changed, and yet the culture hasn't caught up with the new economic realities. If it was just a matter of cultural lag, that the culture hasn't caught up with the new realities, then we could, be worried and unsettled by contemporary circumstances, but we could think, okay, it'll catch up, and we'll just sit back, and over the course of the next generation, culture will adapt, and everything will re-equilibrate. But in fact, at the same time we've been having this economic polarization, we've also been having cultural polarization. So, what does that mean? That means that in the college-educated elite, the lucky third, there has been, over the past generation, a real doubling down on parenthood's primary vocation being developing the skills that your kids need to thrive in a complex modern world. In fact, it's really interesting. There's one study of this change in parenting styles, looked at parenting books. It turns out that all the parenting books written, they've always been how-to manuals, through like the 50s were just all about how to keep your kid healthy, how to keep them safe. And it was just starting in the 60s that you start seeing books of how to develop your kid's brain, and now, we've gone insane with baby Einstein and playing Mozart in the womb and all of that. We also see this statistically, that over the past 20 years, there are economic studies of how people spend their time. And according to these studies, the amount of time that parents spend with their children has gone up over the past 20 years, but most of that is concentrated amongst college-educated parents, that they are spending a lot more time with their kids than they used to. And that, I think, goes along with this cultural shift, recognizing that human capital is a big deal and recognizing that my kids' welfare is going to hinge upon whether they do well in school and whether they develop these skills. Parents are spending more time intensively inculcating this fluency with abstraction into their children. On the other side of the class divide, however, there has been some increase in parenting time, but a countervailing consideration that I think swamps that completely has been the big shifts in family structure. So in particular, the rise of single parenthood, the rise of divorce rates, and therefore the rise of single parent households, which just aren't as favorable an environment for human capital development as intact, stable families, both because there's more money in a two-parent family and there's more parental time in a two-parent family. And so this development, these changes in family structure have real big repercussions on your prospects for developing human capital in the home. And these changes in family structure look very different on either side of the educational divide. About 3%, 4% of births to college-educated mothers are out of wedlock. The overall national average now is 41%. Let's see, those are incredibly stark. A little bit less stark, but still a big deal. As of 2011, 87% of children who have a parent with a bachelor's or higher degree were living with two married parents. So 87% have two-parent families. For high school grads, it's 53%. For high school dropouts, it's 47%. So you see, the high school grads and dropouts are kind of the same. The real difference isn't between the underclass and everybody else. The difference these days is between the elite and everybody else. So this cultural polarization has made the situation much more difficult to catch up with this cultural lag. So what do we do? Well, what's our chief social institutions for developing human capital? Schools, right? That's what they do. And in particular, K through 12, public schools. The whole promise, the whole dream of public schooling in America was that, come in, everybody, we'll take all comers. We don't care what your background is. You come here, it's free, and we're going to give you the skills you need to be a success in America. That promise is not being fulfilled in America's primary and secondary schools today. Instead of mitigating class-based differences amongst students, schools today operate simply to perpetuate those differences. So kids show up at age 5, and they have big differences in test scores between the kids who have college-educated parents and the other kids. And those test score differences just widen and widen and widen over the next 13 years. We can hope for autonomous cultural change, and maybe over time, the message of the imperative of acquiring human capital will sink in more broadly than it has to date, and an increased attention to academic success will spread as a cultural value, and we can close some of the gap that way. But if there is to be, and I think I write about this in the book, and I wrote a new final chapter for the hardcover. So if you get the ebook, you also should buy the hardcover because there's bonus material, director's cut. I think there are reasons to be hopeful that cultural change is going to come, but not complacent by any means. But beyond that, if we want to do anything in our collective capacity as citizens to address this problem, then I have a laundry list of policy prescriptions in the book, and they range all over the map, and the idea was to have the reader read, what in the name of God do all these things have to do with each other? And then I explain how they actually form a coherent package. But for purposes of this talk, I just want to focus on education. And if we are to see, I think, real progress in blotting out this dark lining of this otherwise lustrous silver cloud. It will be through a dramatic restructuring of K through 12 education. I think there are exciting developments along these lines. We've seen in the charter school movement a real focus on closing achievement gaps across racial or socioeconomic lines. And we've seen studies that show that high-quality charter schools, and of course traditional public schools could follow the same kind of path, but they have various institutional obstacles to doing so. But high-quality charter schools that were the subject of these studies have been shown to really dramatically close achievement gaps along racial lines and therefore along socioeconomic lines. And so I think there is a possibility of progress. But it is a huge and daunting task. And so for the time being, we have to look at the world we live in as one of mixed blessings. And the blessings are huge and underappreciated because we take them for granted because it's just like goldfish in a bowl being told that, hey, water is awesome. And you, what's water, right? It's, you don't notice it until you get dumped out of the bowl. So likewise, this complexity we live in and all of the social progress that it has engendered is a great blessing. But that blessing is not equally shared. And it's not fairly distributed because a lot of it hinges upon picking the right parents, and most of us aren't very good at doing that. So I will leave you with that ambiguous pro and con kind of view of where we stand, and thank you for your attention and invite your questions.